Ha ha ha. The laughter echoed off the mahogany walls of Harrison and Cole's law office like something rehearsed. It was not polite. It was not even subtle. It was the kind of laughter that carries a message, that says, without words, we have already won, and we want you to know it. Vera Cassidy sat in the last chair at the far end of the conference table, her fingers laced tightly in her lap, and she did not look up. She had learned, over 34 years of being the quiet one in a loud family, that the best response to cruelty was stillness. Let them laugh. Let them take up all the air in the room. She had learned that from her grandmother. She had learned a great deal from her grandmother. The offices of Harrison and Cole occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Philadelphia. Outside, the Delaware River caught the gray January light and threw it back at the sky. Inside, the air smelled of leather and old money, and the particular tension that gathers whenever a family is about to divide something that cannot be divided evenly. At the head of the table sat Philip Harrison, senior partner, a man whose expression had been professionally neutral for so long it had calcified into permanent blankness. To Vera's left sat her cousin, Derek Whitfield, 36, VP at a commercial real estate firm, a man who had never once in his adult life worn a suit that wasn't perfectly pressed. Beside him sat his older sister Pamela, who was technically attending as a witness, but had arrived with the energy of someone expecting a celebration. Their grandmother, Eleanor Cassidy, had died 11 days ago at the age of 91. Eleanor had been, by any reasonable measure, a difficult woman. She had lived alone in the same house for 60 years, refused every offer to move her into assisted living, and maintained a fierce, almost hostile independence until the very end. The family had largely kept their distance, not out of malice, they told themselves, but because Eleanor made distance easy. Vera had visited anyway, every Sunday, without fail, for the past 6 years. Vera had driven 40 minutes from her apartment in South Philadelphia to Eleanor's house in the Kensington neighborhood. She had brought groceries, fixed stuck windows, sat in the cramped kitchen drinking tea that was always too strong, and listened to Eleanor talk. Eleanor talked about her late husband. She talked about the Depression. She talked about the war and what came after the war, and what people did with themselves when the world suddenly asked them to be ordinary again. Nobody else in the family had time for these conversations. Derek was always closing a deal. Pamela was always managing something. The cousins scattered across 4 states had their own reasons, their own distances. Vera had listened because Eleanor was worth listening to. That was all. Philip Harrison cleared his throat and opened the manila folder in front of him. The last will and testament of Eleanor Ruth Cassidy. He began, his voice carrying the practiced gravity of a man who understood the weight of what he was reading. Derek glanced at his watch. Pamela smoothed her blazer. To my grandson, Derek Whitfield. Harrison read, I leave the entirety of my financial accounts, including the investment portfolio held at Fidelity Investments, the money market accounts at TD Bank, and the contents of my safe deposit box at Citizens Bank, branch 114. The combined value of these assets is approximately $980,000. Derek exhaled through his nose, just over $1 million. He had been expecting more, but his expression settled into something close to satisfaction. To my granddaughter, Pamela Whitfield, I leave the personal property and furniture of the primary residence, including all artwork, jewelry, and heirlooms, to be removed within 60 days of the estate's settlement. Pamela touched the pearl at her throat and nodded. Vera waited, the pause stretched. Harrison turned a page. When he looked up, his eyes found Vera's with an expression she could not quite read. Something between apology and something else. Something more complex. And to my granddaughter, Vera Ann Cassidy. He paused, cleared his throat. Who sat with me when sitting was all I had left to offer. I leave the primary residence at 7 Aldermore Street, including the structure and all fixed physical contents thereof, along with the land upon which it stands. The room was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then Derek laughed. It came out of him like something he had been holding in, a single sharp sound, half disbelief and half genuine amusement. He turned to Pamela, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook. "Aldermore Street," Derek said, tasting the words. "She left you Aldermore Street." Vera knew the house. Everyone in the family knew the house. 7 Aldermore Street was a 3-story Victorian row house that had been quietly deteriorating since the 1980s. The porch roof had collapsed inward on one side. The front facade was covered in thick black mold that crept up from the foundation like something living. The city of Philadelphia had issued 3 separate code violation notices in the past 4 years. The neighbors had filed complaints. A local news segment had once used a photograph of it to illustrate an article about urban blight. "There is an addendum," Harrison said, his tone careful. The room quieted again. "The property is transferred with its existing municipal liens. As of this date, the outstanding property tax debt on 7 Aldermore Street totals $41,000. The city has issued a final notice requiring structural remediation within 90 days, or the property will be condemned and demolished at the estate's expense, with the cost recovered through legal action against the heir. She didn't just leave you nothing, Vera. She left you a debt, $41,000, Pamela said, shaking her head with the practiced sympathy of someone who is not actually sorry. "If you need a referral to a good bankruptcy attorney," Derek offered, "I know several." Professional courtesy. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand to Harrison. They shook. Pamela gathered her things. Neither of them looked at Vera again as they left. Vera sat alone in the conference room for a long time after they were gone. She looked at the deed Harrison had slid across the table. The paper was heavy and formal and utterly indifferent to the circumstances of her life. The student loan payments she was still making at 34, the medical bills from her father's stroke 18 months ago, the credit card balance she had been chipping at for 2 years without visible progress. She thought about Eleanor, about the way Eleanor had looked at her during their last visit, 3 weeks before she died, sharp and clear and deliberate, even through the exhaustion. "The house will tell you what it is," Eleanor had said, out of nowhere, in the middle of a conversation about something else, entirely. "You just have to be willing to look at it properly." Most people look at a thing and see what's wrong with it. You look at a thing and see what it's made of. That's the difference between us and them, Vera. At the time, Vera had thought it was simply Eleanor being Eleanor, elliptical and slightly cryptic in the way that old women who have survived difficult things sometimes are. She was beginning to think it was something else. She picked up the deed and her purse and walked out into the January cold. She drove to Aldermore Street the following morning. The reality of the house in daylight was worse than memory. The porch had not merely sagged. It had given way entirely on the left side, leaving the railing hanging at a 40-degree angle like a broken arm. The front windows were intact, but so deeply filmed with grime they were opaque. The front door, painted once in a dark green that had faded to something closer to grey, was swollen in its frame. It took Vera 3 attempts and her full body weight to push it open. The interior smelled of damp paper, old wood, and something else beneath both. Something mineral and cold, like the inside of a well. She stood in the entry hall and looked. She spent the first 3 days clearing. She rented a dumpster, bought contractor bags and a heavy-duty respirator, and worked from 7 in the morning until she couldn't lift her arms. The physical labor was brutal and clarifying. She hauled 40 years of accumulated newspaper out through the swollen front door. She dismantled towers of boxes. She pulled sheets off furniture that turned out to be worthless. Water-damaged chairs, a dresser with a caved-in side, a settee that disintegrated when she tried to move it. On the 4th day, she started on the walls. She had visited the city planning office beforehand and obtained the original architectural drawings for the house. filed in 1887. She had studied them carefully at her kitchen table the night before, marking load-bearing walls in red pen, identifying which walls she could safely open and which ones she could not touch without compromising the structure. Armed with the blueprints, a 16-pound sledgehammer she had rented from Home Depot, safety goggles, and leather work gloves that raised blisters on her palms, inside an hour she began in the front parlor. The work was loud and slow and satisfying in a way she hadn't anticipated. The plaster was old lime, dense and crumbly, releasing clouds of fine white dust with every swing. She fell into a rhythm, swing, step back, clear the debris, swing again. It was on the afternoon of the 5th day that she noticed the discrepancy. She had been working along the north wall of the ground floor hallway, a long, narrow corridor running from the front parlor to the kitchen at the back of the house. According to the 1887 blueprints, this corridor was 5 feet wide. She pulled her tape measure from her belt and stretched it across the hall. 3 feet, 8 inches. She measured again. The same. She walked to the exterior of the house and measured the outside width of the building at that section. Then she went back inside and measured the internal width again. She stood in the hallway, doing the arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic did not resolve. There was a gap of approximately 14 inches running the full length of the north wall. Between the plaster face she could see and the exterior brick she had measured outside, 14 inches of space that did not appear on any blueprint and was not accounted for by any wall cavity she could identify. Vera pressed her palm flat against the north wall of the hallway and knocked. The sound that came back was not the hollow knock of plaster over empty stud cavity. It was dull and dense, the sound of something solid and thick directly behind the surface. She moved her hand 18 inches to the left and knocked again. Same sound. She moved to the opposite wall and knocked. The familiar hollow return of standard construction, back to the north wall. Dense, resistant. Wrong. Vera retrieved the sledgehammer. She aimed for a section of wall 3 feet from the floor, pulled back and swung. The hammerhead bounced off with a jarring metallic clang that sent a shock wave up both arms and left her gasping. The plaster cracked and a section fell away, but instead of the wooden lath and empty cavity she had been expecting, the exposed surface beneath was dark red brick, hand-laid, tightly mortared, perfectly fitted. Someone had built a second wall. Inside the first wall, running the entire length of the corridor, her hands were shaking as she retrieved her masonry chisel and a 3-pound hand maul from her toolkit. She began working at the mortar between the bricks. Old lime mortar, softer than modern Portland cement, yielding slowly to the chisel's edge. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. The blisters on her palms opened and bled through her gloves. She did not stop. The first brick came free at 4:47 in the afternoon. She caught it before it fell, set it carefully on the floor, and shone her flashlight into the gap. The beam cut through floating dust and illuminated a space that was not a structural cavity. It was a room, narrow, perhaps 16 inches wide, but running the full length of the hallway. Sealed floor to ceiling, with tar paper stapled to wooden framing that had been built specifically to contain it. The floor of the hidden space was raised on a low wooden pallet platform, keeping the contents elevated from any ground moisture. And on that platform, arranged with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, were 4 objects. The first was a heavy rectangular case of dark green canvas, military surplus, secured with 2 brass buckles. The second was a flat cedar box, the kind used for document storage, sealed with a wax stamp. The third was a velvet pouch, dark blue, its drawstring tied in a careful double knot. The fourth was an envelope unsealed, with Vera's name written on the front in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, angular and precise, and utterly unlike the handwriting of someone who had lost her faculties. Vera removed more bricks until the gap was wide enough to reach through. She lifted the envelope first. Vera, if you have found this, it means you did what I knew you would do. You came to the house, you looked at it properly, and you did not stop when it was hard. That is who you are. That is why I chose you. The canvas case contains 40 South African Krugerrand gold coins, 1 troy ounce each, purchased between 1979 and 1993. At current market rates, they are worth approximately $100,000. They are untraceable and entirely yours. The cedar box contains the original trust instrument for the Aldermore Family Trust, established by your grandfather in 1962 and maintained quietly ever since. The trust holds the deed to a commercial property on Market Street in Center City, a 4-story building currently leased to 3 long-term commercial tenants. The annual net rental income from those leases is $190,000. I am the sole trustee. Upon my death, trusteeship transfers to you, the named successor beneficiary. The trust's attorney is Gerald Marsh of Marsh and Associates. His number is on the first page of the instrument. He is expecting your call. The velvet pouch contains something I want you to have for yourself, not to sell. Your grandfather gave them to me in 1959. Do with them as you see fit. Derek will come. He always comes when he smells something he missed. He will tell you the gold and the documents are financial assets that belong to him under the terms of the will. He will be wrong, and the attorney will tell him so, but he will not accept it quietly. Be ready. One more thing. The house is not finished telling you what it is. There is a second ledger in the kitchen, inside the false bottom of the flour canister on the second shelf. It documents 2 more caches. I did not have time to tell you everything in one letter. I love you more than I said. I should have said it more. Eleanor Vera read the letter 3 times, standing in the dusty hallway with plaster in her hair and blood on her gloves. Then she opened the velvet pouch. 7 diamonds slid into her palm, round, brilliant cuts, each one catching the thin winter light from the hallway window and fracturing it into something that did not belong in a house like this, in a life like hers. She did not know their value. She knew they were real, because Eleanor had never kept anything that wasn't. She set them carefully back in the pouch, tucked the pouch into her jacket pocket, and picked up her phone. She called Gerald Marsh first. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Cassidy," he said, without waiting for her to explain. "Eleanor told me you'd call within a week of finding the letter. She said 5 days, actually. You're right on schedule." She gave herself 48 hours to prepare. She used part of that time to visit a certified appraiser named Thomas Okafor, who operated out of a discreet office in Rittenhouse Square and had a reputation for absolute confidentiality. She brought him 10 of the Krugerrands and the velvet pouch. He examined them for 20 minutes, with a loupe and a scale, then sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she recognized as professional composure, being applied to genuine surprise. The coins are authentic. Current spot price puts 10 of them at approximately $26,000. He paused. The diamonds are a different conversation. These are old cuts, mid-century, likely European. The largest stone is approximately 8 carats, VS1 clarity, G color. He set his loupe down. The 7 stones together would conservatively bring $340,000 at auction, possibly more. Vera thanked him, signed his NDA, and drove back to Aldermore Street. She also called a structural engineer, Marcus Webb, whose firm had done work on historic properties throughout Philadelphia. She paid for an emergency assessment. Webb spent 4 hours in the house and delivered his written report the following morning. The primary structure was sound. The foundation, despite its appearance, was solid brownstone. The deterioration was cosmetic and environmental, entirely remediable. She filed the report with the city's Department of Licenses and Inspections before noon. Derek arrived on a Wednesday. She had been expecting it. Eleanor had told her he would come, and Eleanor had been right about most things that mattered. He came with a woman Vera didn't recognize. Professional, clipboard in hand, the particular purposeful stride of someone billing by the hour. Derek himself was in a charcoal overcoat, hair precisely parted, the absolute image of someone accustomed to walking into situations he controls. Vera met them on the porch. "I'm here with a probate consultant," Derek said, without preamble. "Given what's come to light, I've filed an emergency motion with the Orphans' Court to freeze the estate pending a full asset review. The will left me Eleanor's financial assets. If there are financial instruments hidden in this property, which I have reason to believe there are, they belong to me, not to you." "What reason?" Vera asked. "I had the safe deposit box at Citizens Bank inventoried. It was empty." Eleanor was methodical. "An empty box means the assets were moved, and the only place she could have moved them to was here." Vera studied him. He was smarter than she had given him credit for, and she had always given him some credit. "You're welcome to file whatever motions you'd like," she said. "The court will have my attorney's response by Friday. I'm also having the property condemned," Derek said, his voice dropping half a register. "I've spoken with a contact at the city. Given the outstanding violations and the structural assessment—" "The structural assessment was completed yesterday," Vera said. She reached into her jacket and produced a folded copy of Marcus Webb's report. "The building is structurally sound. A copy was filed with the Department of Licenses and Inspections this morning. Any condemnation proceeding initiated without independent grounds will be challenged immediately." She looked at him steadily. "I have an attorney, Derek. A good one. Gerald Marsh, of Marsh and Associates. You may know the name. He drafted Eleanor's original trust instrument in 1962. Something shifted in Derek's expression. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it. "The trust," he said slowly. "The Aldermore Family Trust. Named beneficiary, sole successor trustee upon Eleanor's death." She tucked the report back into her jacket. "The commercial property on Market Street is trust property. It was never part of Eleanor's personal estate. It does not appear in the will because it was never hers to will. It transferred to me automatically upon her death by operation of trust law." She paused. "Your attorneys should have found this during their estate review. I'd suggest finding better attorneys." Derek's consultant was writing something rapidly on her clipboard. "The gold," Derek said. "The physical assets inside this house. The will left me the financial. The will left you the financial accounts," Vera said. "The Fidelity portfolio, the TD bank accounts, the safe deposit box, which Eleanor emptied and redistributed, which she was entirely entitled to do during her lifetime. What is inside this house is physical property, tangible objects located within the structure at the time of her death. My attorney will make this argument before the court. He has made this argument before. He is very good at it." Derek stood on the broken porch for a long moment, the January wind cutting between them, and looked at his cousin. This quiet woman he had dismissed and underestimated for 3 decades, with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. It was the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation he thought he had already figured out. "This isn't over," he said. "File your motion," Vera said. "We'll see you in court." The Orphans' Court of Philadelphia County heard the matter 22 days later. Vera sat beside Gerald Marsh at the respondent's table, her hands folded, her posture composed. Derek sat across the aisle with 2 corporate litigators whose combined hourly rate was, Gerald had informed her cheerfully, approximately 4 times his own. The argument Derek's attorneys made was sophisticated and not entirely without merit, that the Krugerrand coins constituted a financial instrument equivalent to currency, that the diamonds were an investment asset, and that Eleanor's intent in leaving Derek the financial assets of the estate was broad enough to encompass physical stores of value hidden within the property. Gerald Marsh made 3 arguments in response. The first was textual. The will's language was precise: financial accounts, investment portfolio, safe deposit box contents. Eleanor had been represented by competent counsel. She had used specific language because she meant specific things. Physical objects inside a house were not bank accounts, The second was evidentiary. Gerald introduced Eleanor's hidden ledger, authenticated by a handwriting expert, in which Eleanor had categorized her hidden assets explicitly as physical stores, not financial instruments, kept in trust for Vera. Eleanor had anticipated this exact dispute. She had documented her intent. The third argument was the one that ended the hearing. Gerald introduced, as Exhibit C, a complete audit of the Fidelity investment portfolio Derek had inherited. Prepared by a forensic accountant Gerald had quietly commissioned 3 weeks earlier, the audit revealed that Eleanor had, in the final 2 years of her life, taken out substantial margin loans against the portfolio to fund a series of real estate transactions, all of which had been transferred into the Aldermore Family Trust before her death. The Fidelity accounts Derek had inherited were leveraged to approximately $1.4 million in outstanding margin debt, with the underlying assets insufficient to cover the balance. The inheritance Derek had laughed about receiving was underwater by nearly $500,000. The judge, a measured woman named Patricia Hollis, who had been on the bench for 19 years, reviewed the exhibit in silence for a long moment. Then she looked up. The court finds that the physical assets located within the property at 7 Aldermore Street constitute physical contents of the estate, as defined by the will's plain language. The motion to reclassify these assets as financial instruments is denied. She set the papers down. The court further notes that the Aldermore Family Trust is a validly constituted instrument predating the decedent's death by 6 decades, and its assets are entirely outside the scope of this estate. Miss Cassidy's successor trusteeship is valid and uncontested by operation of law. She looked at Derek's attorneys over her glasses. Your client should speak with a financial advisor about the margin situation before he does anything else. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The restoration of 7 Aldermore Street took 8 months. Vera did not gut the house. She did not flip it or sell it or convert it into something unrecognizable. She hired a preservation contractor who specialized in Victorian-era Philadelphia row houses, and she told him she wanted the house to look the way it had looked in 1910, when Eleanor's parents had moved into it as newlyweds. The porch was rebuilt in white oak. The facade was cleaned and repointed, the mold treated and the brick sealed. The interior plaster was repaired and painted in the original colors, a warm ivory in the parlor, a soft sage in the kitchen. The floors were refinished to reveal the original heart pine beneath 40 years of accumulated grime. The north wall of the hallway, the one Vera had opened with a sledgehammer and a masonry chisel and bleeding hands, was replastered and painted like the rest. She did not mark it. She did not preserve it as a curiosity. She simply let it become part of the house again. The second ledger in the kitchen flour canister led her to 2 more caches. One in the attic beneath a false floor panel, containing 30 additional Krugerrands and a collection of uncirculated silver dollars, and one behind the cast-iron fireback in the 3rd floor bedroom fireplace, containing a rolled oilcloth packet of bearer bonds from the 1970s whose value, when she brought them to Thomas Okafor, caused him to remove his glasses and sit quietly for several seconds before speaking. She paid off every debt she carried within the first 3 months, her father's medical bills, her student loans, the credit card, all of it gone, with a clinical efficiency that felt less like celebration and more like putting down a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. The Market Street building continued to generate its rental income, deposited quarterly into the Aldermore Family Trust account, as it had for decades. Quietly, reliably, unspectacularly, the way Eleanor had done everything that actually mattered. As for Derek, the margin calls came due in the spring. His attorneys negotiated a settlement with the brokerage. He did not lose everything, but he lost enough that the word comfortable no longer applied in the way it once had. He did not contact Vera. She did not contact him. On the morning, the restoration contractors finished their final walkthrough and handed her the keys, which were the same keys Eleanor had carried, because Vera had asked them to rekey the locks to match the originals. Vera stood in the entry hall of 7 Aldermore Street and looked at what it had become. The light came through the restored front windows differently than it had come through the grime-coated glass she had first walked past. It was warmer, more present, filling the hallway in a way that made the space feel larger than its dimensions. She thought about Eleanor sitting in this hallway. About Eleanor's parents, who had moved into this house over 100 years ago and made something of a life within its walls. Literally, as it turned out, she thought about what Eleanor had said on that last visit. You look at a thing and see what it's made of. That's the difference between us and them. What 7 Aldermore Street was made of, Vera now understood, was not the rotting wood and crumbling plaster her family had seen. It was not the code violations or the tax lien or the condemned porch. Those were the surface. Those were what you saw if you looked at a thing and stopped looking. Underneath all of that, behind the wall that nobody but Vera had cared enough to open, was 60 years of quiet love carefully stored. She locked the front door, dropped the key into her pocket, and walked down the newly rebuilt porch steps into the spring morning. Behind her, 7 Aldermore Street stood solid and restored on its street, looking exactly like what it had always been. It had just taken someone willing to swing the hammer hard enough to find out. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever been handed something the world said was worthless and discovered it was anything but, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, have you ever looked closely at something everyone else had written off and found something extraordinary underneath?